In January 2018, Margaret and I took this wonderful trip called Spirit of Shackleton to the Falkland Islands, South Georgia and Antarctica. We flew via Buenos Aires to Ushuaia, where we boarded an expedition ship for a 19-day voyage. We booked everything through Orderly Travel. The voyage is operated by a Canadian company, G Adventures. Rather bizarrely, we and our fellow travellers met up at the quayside in Ushuaia to board coaches for the 300-metre trip to our ship. Our home for the next 19 days, the MS Expedition, is the same ship we travelled on in the Arctic in 2014. We began with a couple of sea days, getting reacquainted with the ship, having a number of safety briefings, and getting to know some of the staff and our fellow passengers. There are almost 800 Falkland Islands, but with the great majority of the around 3,000 inhabitants living in Stanley. We spent our first day on two small islands in the northwest. West Point Island is run as a sheep farm plus tourist attraction. We had a nice easy Zodiac landing, followed by a walk over this hill and down to a colony of black-browed albatrosses. It's an amazing experience being right up close to these big birds, which seem to take no notice of people. These are medium-sized by albatross standards, with an average wingspan of about 2.2 metres. They can live for 70 years. In amongst the albatrosses are rockhopper penguins, which choose to be here because the albatrosses offer some protection from skuas, birds of prey that eat penguin eggs and chicks. Although the weather was pleasant, it was quite windy, so I wasn't able to record much of the sound of the birds. This was to be a problem throughout much of the trip. The penguin chicks, in their thick fluffy coats, look bigger than the adults in their more compact waterproof plumage. After our first and spectacular wildlife encounter, we were invited into the farmhouse for tea and cakes. While we were having lunch, the ship moved a few miles to Saunders Island for our next landing. Saunders Island has a number of different types of penguin and a spectacular sandy beach. This was a typical pattern of our daily activities. We had one operation, as they referred to them, in the morning, back on the ship for lunch, during which time the ship would move on, then a second operation in the afternoon. An operation would be a landing, allowing about 3 hours ashore, or sometimes a Zodiac cruise. Each evening, before dinner, we would all get together in the lounge for a recap of the day's events and a briefing about the plan for the next day. While we were on Saunders Island, the wind picked up, creating quite a sandstorm on the beach. Quite why these penguins chose to brave the rocks when there was a sandy beach alongside was a mystery. The strong winds also made the return to our ship and getting back onto the ship from the Zodiac quite bumpy, wet and exhilarating. Overnight, the ship travelled around the north of the Falkland Islands, arriving at Stanley at breakfast time. We had the whole day in Stanley. In the morning, we took a walk around Gypsy Cove. The beaches looked very inviting, but were out of bounds due to the presence of landmines. Fortunately, the geese and penguins are too light to set off the mines. Margaret and I had a fish and chip lunch in a pub in Stanley, the Victory Bar, and then walked around the small town and visited the museum. As you might expect, the town feels very remote and also very much like a throwback to Britain several decades ago. From the Falkland Islands to South Georgia took 2 full days at sea. As well as a number of interesting talks, we had to go through a quite thorough biosecurity process. Boots and walking poles had to be cleaned and disinfected, and all outer clothing and backpacks had to be vacuumed, with particular attention to Velcro. All this is to prevent the spread of non-endemic plants and diseases to South Georgia. The Falkland Islands had been fascinating, and the wildlife viewing had certainly exceeded my expectations. But South Georgia was the destination I was most looking forward to. We had 4 days there, exploring all along the north coast. On arrival, we had our usual morning wake-up call from Jonathan, the expedition leader.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Wednesday, 18th of January 2018. Local time 6:30 a.m. Expedition is currently at anchor in the Bay of Isles, South Georgia. The outside temperature is a relatively balmy 5 degrees Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. At about 8:20 we'll be sending out a scout boat. So please listen out for further announcements, and a very good morning to all.
And we were soon ashore on Salisbury Plain, with its tens of thousands of king penguins and spectacular scenery. It's an amazing experience, and not nearly as smelly as I had been led to believe. You aren't allowed to approach within 5 metres of wildlife, but if you stay still, they frequently walk right up to you. Big brown balls of fluff are king penguin chicks. They look nothing like the adults until they get their waterproof feathers when about 1 year old. Down by the beach there were lots of fur seals, including many pups. After being hunted almost to extinction during the 18th and 19th centuries, fur seals are now everywhere along the coast of South Georgia, and Pryan Island is no exception. The density is such that keeping 5 metres away from everything isn't really practical. We were here to see wandering albatrosses. These birds have an average wingspan of over 3 metres. They can live for more than 50 years and spend most of their lives in flight. Some have been tracked covering more than 75,000 miles in 1 year. The trip we were on was called Spirit of Shackleton, and we had several talks about Ernest Shackleton and his 1914 expedition that included a hike across South Georgia in the middle of winter. We had the opportunity to walk the last few miles of that hike. The ship dropped about 30 of us off in Fortuna Bay, and we walked up and over a mountain pass to Stromness Bay. It wasn't particularly far, but the steep descent down this scree slope was tricky. South Georgia was the centre of the whaling industry in the Southern Hemisphere during the 19th century and up until about 1940. Stromness was one of the whaling stations, now derelict and out of bounds because of asbestos. The weather on our trip so far had been good. Cool winds but not biting, and quite a lot of sunshine. There was snow on the mountains, but lots of greenery around the coast. Soon after we left Stromness, we saw our first iceberg, no doubt from one of the many glaciers nearby. A little further down the coast, Grytviken is another former whaling station, the only one that has been cleaned up and is now the only settlement on South Georgia. Ernest Shackleton was buried here. The fur seals we had been seeing up to now have front flippers they can prop themselves up on and use almost like legs. In contrast, true seals, also known as earless seals, like these female elephant seals, can't do that and have much more difficulty moving on land. In Grytviken we also saw our first molting penguins. We were given a guided tour of Grytviken by one of the staff who spend the summer here. Like the Falkland Islands, South Georgia is a British overseas territory. It even has a post office. St Andrews Bay has a huge colony of king penguins, plus fur seals and elephant seals. Many of the penguins were molting, so couldn't go in the sea. As the temperature was a rather warm +3 degrees or so, they can overheat, so they stand in the water flowing off the glacier to keep cool. When the seal hunters and whalers came to South Georgia, they brought rats with them. For the past 7 years, South Georgia has been undertaking a major project to eradicate them, because they obviously have a huge negative impact on all the birds which nest on the ground. As at the beginning of 2018, they were still doing checks, but believe they have been successful. On our final day in South Georgia, the plan was to visit a colony of macaroni penguins in Cooper Bay, but unfortunately the sea was too rough for us to land, so we instead went to Drygalski Fjord, right at the southeastern tip of South Georgia. It was a pretty foul day weather-wise, but we did get out on a Zodiac and saw these snowy sheathbills. That concluded our 4 wonderful days in South Georgia, and we soon set off towards the Antarctic Peninsula. Along the way we passed Elephant Island, a very bleak spot in the South Shetland Islands. This small rocky area is where 22 of Shackleton's expedition team spent 4.5 months waiting to be rescued in 1916. Elephant Island was the only place on the trip where we saw macaroni penguins. It was too rough to take video, so all I got was these stills. From that point on we began to see ever bigger icebergs. We passed one tabular berg, like this one, that was over 20 miles long. This being midsummer in the southern hemisphere, the air temperature down at the Antarctic Peninsula was around freezing point. Not too bad in calm air, but you needed to be very well wrapped up when it was windy, which was most of the time. There's no green in Antarctica, apart from odd patches of algae, but the scenery is magnificent. I got some welcome exercise at Brown Bluff, walking up a steep hill in thick snow. The penguins here are adelies. The chicks wait on shore while the parents go fishing. They gather in large groups and rush into the sea, hoping there is safety in numbers. Their caution is justified. This is a leopard seal, the penguin's main predator. The number of people allowed ashore at any one time is strictly limited in Antarctica and much of South Georgia. Mostly the limit is 100. In some places it was even fewer. With only 124 passengers on our ship, some of whom went kayaking, we never had a problem getting ashore when we wanted to, or being chased back to the ship to make way for others. This was one of only 2 places where we saw chin-strap penguins. The Zodiac trips varied from a few really calm ones where it was safe to get a camera out, to very bumpy rides when you got completely soaked. Boot cleaning was quite a ritual, as penguin poo is very smelly and also very sticky. Penguins aren't always clean and white. These Adelie chicks can't go in the sea yet, so never get washed. These gentoos are much more photogenic. The adults feed the chicks by regurgitating food from their stomachs. On the subject of feeding, the food on the MS Expedition was excellent. Despite there being nowhere to take on supplies, apart from a few items in Stanley, there was a surprising amount of fresh fruit and vegetables right through to the end of the trip. This morning we woke to a very overcast day and a message that our planned landing would not take place because of too many seals on the beach. We would instead be taking a Zodiac cruise. As we boarded our Zodiacs, it began to snow quite heavily. What they hadn't told us in advance was that the captain had spotted humpback whales ahead. We spent a delightful 3 hours in a Zodiac, barely noticing the cold, as whales popped up all around us. At one point one swam right under our Zodiac. They were using a technique called bubble feeding, where a few of them swim up in a spiral, exhaling air to create a column of bubbles, which causes the krill that they eat to become trapped. They then swim up through the krill with their mouths wide open. The krill being brought up to the surface also creates an opportunity for easy food for the penguins. On our cruise, as with most Antarctic expedition cruises, there were 2 optional activities, kayaking and camping overnight in Antarctica. Margaret and I didn't do either, but there were a good few takers. The Lemaire Channel, which many consider to be the most scenic part of the Antarctic Peninsula, was pretty much the southernmost point of our journey. That afternoon we had a bit of excitement when our landing at Peterman Island had to be aborted because the ship started dragging its anchor in sudden increasing winds. Margaret and I had just set foot on the island when we were told to get straight back on the Zodiac for a rapid and very wet ride back to the ship. On our final day before setting off north across the Drake Passage, we spent the morning at Nico Harbour, where there's a glacier that calves frequently. Only smallish pieces broke off while we were there. During the Second World War, the British Army established a base on the Antarctic Peninsula, though it isn't clear that the soldiers there had any useful purpose. The base at Port Lockroy is now a museum, and a post office that featured on the BBC documentary called Penguin Post Office. And that concluded our trip, apart from a not too rough crossing of the Drake Passage and long flights home. It had been a very special holiday.